I was in my 20s the first time I met Phil. He, his wife Kelly, and their 3 kids had moved to Sucre, a little whitewashed town in Bolivia, South America. Shortly after the shaky plane ride, Phil had me on the back of his rickety blue motorcycle delivering quinoa meals to the local Quechua people who begged on the streets. As we rode around, he would scan the streets looking for familiar faces, while I held on his waist tightly, just praying we wouldn't tip over. Every few minutes, Phil would pull up to a sidewalk. Above the noise of the motorcycle engine and the crazy traffic, he'd call out a person's name. I'd hop off the bike, run over to this homeless stranger, and give him a packaged meal. Then I'd hop back on the bike and we'd be off again. I felt like a real Christian. I was literally serving the poor with my hands. I was feeding the hungry just like Jesus said we should do. Wasn't this what Christian service was all about? For a long time, I thought being a faithful Christian meant becoming the next Mother Teresa. I thought serving God meant I had to have this odd cocktail of emotional unhappiness and spiritual joy in the Lord. If I didn't have a cross to bear, or even just some measure of extreme discomfort, how could I be a genuine Christian? So I started going on regular mission trips to small villages and towns in Latin America, working in the hot sun, not bathing for days, and sleeping on the floors of dirty rooms. I wanted that feeling that I had while I was riding around with Phil and feeding the beggars. I wanted to feel like I was really serving God. But then a funny thing happened. During my last year of divinity school, I was offered a job working with street children in Honduras. It was exactly what I thought I wanted to do. But still, something just didn't sit right about that decision. I wasn't scared about moving to another country. No, it was something I couldn't name. I just didn't have a sense of peace that this job was the next step for me. So I prayed and I listened for God, and eventually it seemed clear that God was pulling me towards something that, for a traveler like me, felt even more radical than heading to Honduras. I felt like it was time for me to sit still and learn to serve God in ways that aren't full of novelty and adventure. I came to believe that my place, at least for the time being, was right where I was, in Durham, North Carolina. Now, I'm pretty confident God would have had much to teach me in Honduras, but I never really expected God to teach me anything in Durham. I think the lack of peace I felt about leaving the country was a little nudge from God that helped me discover that service isn't something that happens out there. It's possible and maybe even essential to serve God anywhere I find myself. So I stayed. And I started getting to know people whose needs aren't always so obvious. People in my community, people I bought food from, people I saw on my way to work, people I lived next door to. I made a point of spending time with the kids in my neighborhood, doing stuff like inviting them over to my house for pancakes or making dolls out of popsicle sticks, yarn, and fabric. There's this one little girl, Abby, who I met when she was just 4 years old. I can't believe Abby is 16 now, and I've mentored her through grade school and junior high. We've had those kind of necessary talks that teenagers find hard to have with their parents. By staying put, I've had the privilege of being part of Abby's life for a long time. And then there was Mike, a young guy who lived between shelters. I'd see him several times a week at the top of the highway exit near my house. Eventually, Mike and I started talking, and I learned something about his story, and he learned something about mine. And these conversations with Mike, they made it clear to me that not every homeless person is looking for a handout. A lot of folks like Mike just want to be seen as full people who are worthy of real conversations and who are recognized as children of God. These experiences changed my ideas about what it means to serve God, what it means to act justly, to practice hospitality and generosity. Sometimes it means getting hot and dirty while handing out quinoa on the streets of a developing city. And sometimes it means having a conversation with the guy at the exit ramp. At the end of the day, Christian service is about loving one another well and making ourselves available to meet one another's needs as much as we can. I happen to believe that God intends the church to be a sign, a symbol, and a foretaste of the kingdom of God. But I also happen to believe in a pretty expansive notion of the church. It isn't just the space we gather on Sundays. It's found wherever we practice serving God by using our hands and feet to bring a fraction more healing in the broken spaces of the world and in the broken lives of others. You see, when people serve others, the world gets a glimpse of God, and it's almost like Christ takes on flesh all over again. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells us that he is among us as the one who serves. But if we're honest with ourselves, we know it's not easy to want to mimic a God who does things like empty himself of his godness and takes the form of a slave. A God who calls us to consider others better than ourselves. Practically everything in our Western culture tries to convince us that the best position is that of the one being served. The world wants us to carry our gold-plated crowns around with us everywhere. You know, the crowns studded with our accomplishments, our degrees, our titles and possessions. And it can be hard to set those crowns down in order to pick up popsicle sticks and pancake skillets. I think the shift for us comes when we learn to recognize that as children of God, we're not only responsible for our brothers and sisters, whether they're Christian or not, but that their gains are our gains and their losses are our losses. Once we make that shift, we see that there are countless ways to serve one another. Striving for just wages for the underpaid, that's an act of service. Lobbying for better immigration laws that keep families intact, that's an act of service. Developing a relationship with that homeless woman who hangs out by that coffee shop you always go to, that's an act of service. Even creating curriculum that teaches people about marginalized populations, even that's an act of service. Every time we extend our hands, we embody the church, and we bear the reality that we all carry Christ within us wherever we go. I really believe that saying that service is rooted in seeing. To truly be open to serving God in whatever way God calls us, and to serve one another, we have to be able to see the Imago Dei, that holy image in all people. Martin Luther King Jr. said that anybody can be great because anybody can serve. That sounds pretty similar to something Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew. Whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave, just as the Son of Man came not to be served but to serve. Now believe me, I definitely don't have it all figured out yet. I'm just hoping I'm learning to serve God faithfully right where I am. I know full well that God could lead me to serve in a very different way tomorrow, or next week, or 10 years from now. But faithful service takes practice. Transforming our minds and hearts to love as Christ loved requires patience, the work of the Spirit, the grace of God, and our active participation of seeking to live out this holy love. There aren't special rules for service. Just look for a Mike, or an Abby, or a neighbor who needs a pot of soup or a hand with the yard work. I was convinced I had to get on a plane to serve God, when I could do it just as faithfully by walking out my front door. Step outside and see for yourself. Over the next few days, you'll explore some different ways to serve others. And as you do, I hope you'll discover that every act of service is a way of joining in with what God is already doing in the world, that all service is kingdom service.